Hi guys, in the previous video we looked at some characteristics of a perfect square. So let's get into this activity by identifying what perfect squares are. Since we now have known the characteristics, what we should look for in a quadratic expression to determine whether or not it's a perfect square. So we're asked here to identify perfect squares. Now what we're going to be doing, we're going to put a tick beside those quadratics that are perfect squares, and we're going to put an X beside the ones that aren't. Okay, so we're asked here to identify number one, if it's a perfect square. So as we have been doing in the previous exercise, I am going to take a half of b, I'm going to square that, okay, and that must be equal to a times c. Now a half of b, which is in this case negative 2, and I'm going to square it, and that must be equal to, in this case, a is 1 and c is also 1. Now a half of 2, we know that a half of 2 is 1, okay, and a positive times a negative will give me a negative, and I'm going to square my negative 1, and that must be equal to 1 times 1 is 1. Now we know that this is, over this side we're going to get negative 1 times negative 1 since it's all squared, and negative 1 times negative 1 will give us a positive 1, and positive 1 is equal to positive 1. Okay, so we know that number 1 is a perfect square, so let's tick that. Number 2, basically what I'm going to be saying here in number 2 is that is the same thing we're going to be doing. So this was number 1, so in number 2 I'm going to take again a half of b, and I'm going to square that, and that must be equal to a times c. Now a half of b in this case is 12, so I'm going to take a half of 12, I'm going to square all of that, and that must be equal to 9, which is a times 4. Okay, now a half of 12, we know that 6, and I'm going to say 6 square must be equal to 9 fourths, 36. Now 6 squares 6 square rather is 36, and 36 is equal to 36. So again we have a perfect square, so let's tick that. Okay, all right, in number 3 we have 9q squared minus 6q minus 9. However, when I look at my c, I notice here, let me use another color. When I look at my c, I notice here in my c I have a negative 9, and we had stated earlier in the previous video rather, that if c or a is negative, it doesn't matter which one, then it will not be a perfect square. Okay, all right, so we have looked at those. Let's clear the way. Oh well, let me pull up my screen a bit, and let's work through number 4. All right guys, now again let's look at this. We're going to take a half, the coefficient of y here. So I have y over 2, and we know that y over 2 is the same as to divide by 2. Remember, it's the same as multiplying by a half. So what we have here, the coefficient of y is really a half. Okay, so again I'm going to take a half of b, and I'm going to square it. Okay, and it's always nice to work with fractions, you shouldn't be scared of them. So a half times b here is a half, it's obvious there, we have a half, and we're going to square that. Okay, and that should be equal to the coefficient of y squared is 1 times the constant, in this case is a fraction, 1 over 16. So again I am going to say a half times a half will give me 1 over 4. Okay, and I'm going to square my 1 over 4, and that must be equal to 1 times 1 over 16 will give me 1 over 16. Now I have a quarter square, so I must multiply a quarter by itself twice. Okay, so I have a quarter times a quarter must be equal to 1 over 16, and here we can see that we will arrived at the same answer. Okay, so I have a quarter. 1 times 1 will give me 1 over 4 times 4 will give me a 16. All right, let me just pull up this a bit for you. 4 times 4 is 16. So I have 1 over 16 is equal to 1 over 16. So again, I have a perfect square here. So in this exercise, we had 3 perfect squares. Okay, let's pull it down a bit. We had 3 perfect squares and one that wasn't. Okay, a perfect square. So it's that easy, guys. Okay, and as we go along, you'll get used to it. So feel free to comment or post your questions, and we will help you if you have any additional questions. Bye.